Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is 7th period, and I have some wonderful AP biologists. Say hi.
Hi.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to talk about behavioral ecology. And one of the first pictures in the, because this part you did independently, was talking about Lorenz and his goslings. And that is a classic experiment you probably want to be familiar with. And in that experiment, Lorenz took the goslings, he removed the mother, and then when they hatched, he was the first thing moving around back and forth over their face. So they did something on him. What did they do to him? What? Imprinted. Yes. So they imprinted on him. And why is that an and then they followed him wherever he went. Why is that a great adaptation for survival and for fitness? What? Say that again?
They can see what the parents are doing and learn the things that the parents
Yeah, the parents are probably going to protect them, right?
Yeah.
That's where, if you're talking about resources, were you thinking maybe the parents would provide nutrients for them?
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, and so, so it allowed, I've been going since 7:20, non-stop at all. I peed once during nutrition, so I can't do the help you, motivate you at this moment. I just need you to participate. Got it? Okay. So, it's good and helpful because they're going to be more likely to survive if you have parents who are taking care of you. So imprinting is very adaptive. So the process of imprinting, do you think that's innate or learned? What do you think? I hear one answer. What do you think? Do you agree? What do you think it is? Innate or learned?
Innate.
Yeah, the process of imprinting is innate because they're doing it from birth. Nobody taught them how to do it. It's like mama, okay? And then that's who they're going to be. The part that's learned, though, is who their mama is, right? Birds are able to sing. They have the ability to make noise since birth, but they have to learn the appropriate song, right? So your behavior is a mixture of what's in your DNA and what's in your environment. And that was the big question that was asked is, as far as your behavior goes, is there a genetic basis for inheritance? Absolutely. Is learning involved? Absolutely. And what you want to be familiar with is, do you know some of the classic experiments to support innate and behavioral learning? So one of the ones is looking at those lovebirds. And if you remember, the lovebirds, depending on what species they are, they created two different types of nesting material. So some made a bunch of short strands that they would do what? Put in their booties, right? And then others made long strands that they carried. And so the question, so you had long strands that were carried in their beak, or several short strips that they put in their feathers right here. And so the idea was, if this is kind of an innate process to know cut short or cut long, then if you made a hybrid of these two lovebirds, then they should have intermediate length nesting materials. And is that what happened? Yeah. And then the problem came, how do you carry them? And the hybrid made those intermediate lengths, and he would try to tuck them in the tail feathers, but what would happen? It would just fall out. And so they learned they will fall out, so I have to carry them in my beak. But forevermore, before they would, they stopped trying to tuck them in the tail feathers, but they'd always take a quick look at the butt and then go, okay, yeah, I got to carry it, and then fly away. So that was an example of innate behavior. Another one is with snakes. And it was clear that depending on where the snakes were, they had a preference for their food, whether it was slugs or not slugs. And they were wondering, is that something that has to do with their DNA? And what came about is the number of tongue flicks, because when they flick their tongue, what are they doing? They're tasting the air. So if you have a bunch of tongue flicks, you're aware that the slugs are in your environment. But if you have fewer tongue flicks, you're not aware of the slugs, so you're not interested in them. And once again, when they interbred them, they had an intermediate affinity for slugs because they had an intermediate number of tongue flicks. So that is also another experiment showing about our behavior being innate in our genes. And then also when you analyze twins. Now, it's not generally accepted today that if there's a family that you separate all the members of the family out for adoption. You usually try to keep family members together. But in this case, these sisters were separated at birth, and the social worker used them as a little experiment and documented everything they did and was overwhelmed by the amount of similarities between the two, even though they weren't raised together. And so that was evidence of genetic basis of behavior. Involving your hormones, Aplysia, when they make their eggs, they will make just thousands and thousands of eggs and whip them around in a circle. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of energy in order to do that. And even though they hadn't mated, they could get them to do the egg laying process by just injecting them with that hormone. So you would think you would go, wait, I haven't mated, there's nothing here to fertilize the eggs. It's a complete waste of time and energy to invest in all those eggs at that point. So again, showing you that your behavior was innate. And then I think you remember about the mice and how mothering they were, and there's a gene, and if this gene is active, they'll huddle them together and take care of them, but if that gene wasn't active, they let them wander away. Okay, so those are all genetic bases of inheritance, and some things that look genetic are called FAPs, and those stand for fixed action patterns, where you do it in the same way every single time, and it triggers that behavior. And these FAPs, though, can improve over time. Oh, here's an example of FAPs, mating dances, okay, the way you make a web. But learning can go about changing that experience, and the idea is that it could improve it, but it may have to do with maturity and that they can perform that task better. One type of behavior that would be learned behavior is habituation, and your ability to ignore things that aren't going to bother you. A deer in a zoo is not startled by people walking around them. But if they were out in nature, you couldn't walk up to, an elk or anything that close, but at the zoo you can. Why? They have learned you can't hurt me. There's a barrier between us. And I think probably when I did this online, I talked about a lion, and a lion in the wild would totally attack you, but at the zoo it doesn't come over to you because it knows I can't get past this cage. So that's an example of habituation. And back to food learning, the baby birds will peck on the mom's beak to try to get her to regurgitate food, and they get better at it over time, and it probably has to do with maturity of their ability to control their muscles. But this pecking is what's called a sign stimuli. It's a releaser, just like in our most favorite sticklebacks. Do you remember what was the releaser for the sticklebacks? The red color. And they did experiments. It's not like this for us, but in England, the mail delivery trucks have big red circles on the side of them. And what they would notice is on the road right next to their lab, they had big windows in the lab, and they had their stickleback in tanks right there. When the mail truck would drive up with its big red circle on the side, all the sticklebacks would start to go against the side of the cage, or their, not cage, aquarium, trying to attack the mail truck that's outside, because that red is a releaser to them. So pecking right here is a releaser to regurgitate that food. Now, if the baby is too weak to peck on the mom or the dad to get him to regurgitate, and it's not done strenuously enough, then the parent won't regurgitate. Why is that an adaptation?
Because the child will not be, or the baby will not be matured enough to take the food.
I'm going with something else. Yeah.
They're not going to survive anyway.
Yeah. So give your food and resources to those who can get it, right? So that can be something that's selected for. So that releaser, sometimes it's coupled with movements and a color, or thing, to really solidify that you know how to do that, to release that behavior. Okay. We talked about imprinting already with ducks and learning the songs. There are usually certain times where you can learn that song best, and if you don't teach them that song, they'll be able to sing, much like a deaf person who's never been taught how to make their mouth make the sounds that you and I can recognize. They can make sounds, but it's not something that can trigger the appropriate response. The sender is making sounds, but the receiver can't interpret it. So there is a time when you can teach those birds, and it looks like social behavior and having a tutor is most significant in that process. All right, another type of learning is called associative learning, where you associate one thing with another. If a dog is always beat with a newspaper, pretty soon it will begin to fear what? Newspapers. That is associative learning, because you're associating something bad's going to happen to me if that newspaper comes out. But on a positive note, if you keep your leash to take your dog lovingly on a walk in the same cupboard, and every single time you go to the closet to open it, your dog's like, no, I'm so excited, okay, because it knows what's coming next. We are going for a walk, okay? Then it's associating that cupboard with that treat. Some of you, I noticed, you can tell when I'm about ready to say not it, and your hand is already in not it position, or you do, yeah, your nose, yes.
Does learning count as, sorry,
Yes.
Language, does language count as associative learning?
It's learning. I don't know that I would put it as associative learning. Hello. Thank you so much.
Of course.
It's a very sweet. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, did you? Oh, I have some in my car. Sorry. Yeah, this day, I didn't mean to snap at you, but this day is long because it started at 0 period, and then I taught second period, and then I taught fourth period, and then I helped kids at lunch, and then I taught freshmen, and now I'm helping you, and then I'm going to give an in-service. So we've been going since, I think I got here about 7 this morning, so I'm like nonstop, and she brought coffee. This is Jessica. Okay, so let's see, I can't remember, I lost my train of thought. Monarchs, butterflies. I didn't answer your question. Is language, it is learning, but I don't know if I would call it associative learning. Why would you call it associative learning?
Because you're talking about your dog, and I know my dog knows words like park, walk, and like leash, and he'll get super excited. His ears will perk up if we say any of those words.
Okay, then you've associated that. Yes, that would be good. Yeah, you can associate that. If your mom's yelling at you, that's associative learning. Like, oh, mom's mad. Okay, right? Okay, so classical conditioning has to do with physiological responses, and in this case, just like what you were describing, and what they did with Pavlov's dogs is normally when they'd bring the food in, the dog would start salivating. So before they brought the food in, they started ringing a bell. And pretty soon, all you had to do was ring the bell, and they'd start salivating because that triggered the next response. So if you say leash, now if you say leash a bunch of times and you don't actually get the leash, you're gonna have some deconditioning, right? It's not gonna work. What did you say?
He gets like all sad, and he'll leave my room.
Yeah, pretty soon he's gonna know that you're a liar, pantalones and fuego, and not to trust you when you say leash. Okay? So this triggers that physiological response in the dog. I like this. How is this classical conditioning? Right? He salivates, and Pavlov writes in his lab notebook, right? So the dog is saying he conditioned the person. Hey, when did we have our final going?
We did.
When's our final? Is it Thursday of next week?
It's the week after. Yeah. That's the week after. Not next week, the week after, yeah. It's the week after.
Oh, okay, never mind. All right. Because we have a I thought it was next Thursday.
No. If it is, let's move it.
It's not?
Thursday we have a quiz. I thought we have like a double.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay.
And the final like next.
I'm worried about that because we have a full on that day.
We should cancel it.
I don't know. Okay. So, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is behavior. And this is rewards and punishment, and there's a lot of parenting involved here you can associate this with, except hopefully none of your parents put you in a Skinner box which had electrodes on the bottom. So if you did the bad thing, it would electrocute you, and if you did the good thing, you get a little shock if it's bad. If you did the good thing, then you got food. And so using rewards and punishments, you can train organisms or animals to do all different things, like play ping pong, ride around on little cars. You can get elephants to stand on little things cruelly, you know, all those types of things. Circus. So this kind of compares and contrasts the two. Migratory behaviors, it must be adaptive to migrate. We already talked about that. The costs must outweigh, or the benefits must outweigh the costs of your migratory behavior. And you want to be able to navigate to where you're going. And if you're in a storm, to be able to correct your, you know, be oriented to the right direction and go there. Observation, imitation, watching somebody else and then mimicking that behavior. Birds sometimes do that, right? If you talk to the bird and then it mimics that same behavior. I think that probably the example I gave you for this presentation was about watching your parents make spaghetti a certain way and then you make spaghetti or scrambled eggs that same way. And then this one, insight, this is where something you've never been trained or taught or modeled for you, and you figure out how to do it, okay? And so a really good example of this is not chimps stacking up boxes, because that experiment has not been repeated, but it is in a lot of textbooks, is crows. And crows, when they have food hanging on a string, if you tried to fly by, the food would move, so they'd stand up there and pull the string and pull the food up towards them so they could eat it. So that would be an aha moment or insight. Okay, I'm going to keep going because I probably had questions in there. Okay, communication. Yes?
So I know that the monkey experiment wasn't ever repeated.
Yes.
But is it still kind of insight if that one monkey...
If it worked, yes.
Okay.
But some people wonder about the validity of the experiment because you haven't been able to repeat it. Yeah. So if you look on here, here are the key things. An action by a sender that influences the behavior of another. It's beyond just reproducing. It takes cooperation. Can you think of the 4 types of ways to communicate? Which ones work day, night, both? Which ones are the fastest? Okay, so think through that right now. What are the 4 types of communication? Which ones work at day? Which one works at night? Which one works both? Which ones are the fastest? Okay, so give me the 4 types.
Chemical.
Okay, auditory, visual. Go ahead, what else? Chemical, tactile. Okay, so let's do day, night, or both. What's this one? Auditory, what is it? Both? Fast or slow? Fast. Good. Visual. Usually day, and it can be what? Fast, right? But it's usually day. Chemical. Both and what? Slow. Tactile. Both. And it would be fast. You're touching them, right? And sometimes you'll use a combination of these. You will do a visual with an auditory, in order to really communicate that information, right? To be more clear. And also so it won't get hijacked by another organism who wants to like eat you, okay? So that's another thing that would work. All right, and so then I just gave you some examples of chemical communication and auditory. I played that girl, Mel, and all the things she did. But the key one on here that I want to talk to you about on tactile is I want you to think about that bee dance. And if the hive was right here, okay, here's the hive, okay? If the sun is right here, okay, and the food is, it's a black poisonous flower. If the food is right here, how would that bee dance? Now the sun's big enough in the sky that it doesn't matter if it's here. Okay. How would that bee dance? Okay. would it dance like this and come around and go like this and come around that way? How would it go? Down, okay? Because what you're saying is you would take a look at the angle of the sun, right, to the food, and you would want to have you would say, okay, you don't want to fly straight up to the sun, you want to fly in this direction towards that food, right? And it would come around. What do these waggles do? The distance. And that is species specific. Okay, and that's a waggle dance. And that is a classic form of communication that you would talk about. We talked about the importance of circadian rhythms. When you do these behaviors, when you mate, all of those types of things are going to be based on circadian rhythms, and it's going to be selected for. What else? Not being able to tell time. We talked about the period gene. I think that's it. Not get your period, but okay. Then next we talked about behavioral ecology, how natural selection shapes our behavior. We've already discussed that many times. And where am I? We talked about foraging behavior, and that you want to be efficient when you're looking for nutrients. You don't want to waste your time doing something that's not going to give you a good output, a good resource of nutrients. And we talked about mating strategies, and we talked about how male and female mating strategies might be different. Jessica, look at this one.
I'm already agreeing. What? Oh.
Okay, male and female strategies, because she's looking for love, because she's looking for what? Commitment and what? Protection and stability. And he's looking just to pass his genes, so he might be looking for something else. This should be a review for you. Intrasexual, intersexual mating, are you good on that? And sexual dimorphism, we've already talked about that. That should be a good review. Intrasexual selection is within that, like two males fighting with each other. We talked about how that could lead to dominance hierarchies, because the higher ranking male is the one that's going to be reproducing. Did I go too fast through any of that? You need me to review any of that? Okay. We talked about sociobiology, organisms living together, and the benefits of living together. More eyes, you can work together, cooperative and defense, to distract, to care for young. And the downfalls of living together is crowding, you may not reproduce as much, you might pass disease along. And we looked at something called altruism, or self-interest. And so, versus self-interest. So it looks like sometimes some behavior is sacrificial. It would reduce the fitness of yourself. And what sociobiologists are saying is probably nothing is given as a sacrifice, truly, because you're looking out for the welfare of your what? Yourself, by getting your genes passed on. So usually you're doing that, if it's truly a sacrifice, like a life sacrifice, you're probably doing that in order to protect your young, your family members. Because we said fitness is ultimately being able to pass on your what? Genes. So probably the reason why you're screaming is to protect your offspring. And we talked about indirect selection. It would be kin selection, where you're looking out for your whole family. Direct selection is your individual passing on, looking at just your own self. We also talked about things like this. This is not going to be a life or death, but because they're so related, that if one chimp gets to have sex and another one doesn't, they may not fight over that, because ultimately they're getting their genes passed on. And we also looked at reciprocal altruism with vampire bats, saying, you know what, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. You regurgitate a blood meal for me now, I'll regurgitate blood meal for you later. And if you don't and you're a cheater, then I will what? I won't kill you, but I will what? Ignore you, take you out. Any questions or concerns? Feeling strong? Okay, where could you get some practice questions over this? The book, good. Okay, love you very much, good job. Eat some toast.